Welcome back to Carneades.org. Today we're going to be continuing with our series analyzing African philosophy. In this video we're going to be looking at what is Negritude, the philosophy. In the previous video in this series we covered Negritude as a movement. Today we're going to be looking at it in terms of its specific philosophical tenets. So, Negritude is a philosophical, poetic, and political movement most closely associated with Léopold Sédar Senghor, Aimé Césaire, and Léon Gontran Damas. The movement focuses on the affirmation and valuation of Black peoples and the Black experience in the world. Cesaire and Damas viewed Negritude as a poetic movement, while Senghor enunciated more philosophical content of the movement, though Cesaire enunciated some content as well. In the last video, as we'll see here, we covered Negritude as a movement. In this video, we're going to focus on Senghor's expression of the movement as a philosophical position. Now, Belgian philosopher Leo Apostel summarized Senghor's Negritude ontology of life force with 7 principles. If you watched our earlier video on Bantu philosophy, you should see the resemblance, which Senghor embraced this resemblance between his views and Bantu philosophies as a justification for his philosophy, but Césaire, of course, rejected. Check out that video for that debate. These 7 principles were that existence is equivalent to life force. One is, if and only if, one is a force. Each force is unique and individual. They are not part of a single greater force. Kind of that question of the one and the many we might see in very early philosophy. Different things have different types and intensities of forces. Forces can be reinforced, added to, or deforced, weakened. Forces can act upon each other. All forces are organized into a hierarchy by strength, with God at the top, and stronger forces act upon weaker forces. So this is an ontology of life forces, this idea of there exists in people life forces that organize them into a hierarchy, can be weakened, can be strengthened, etc. Now, for Senghor, a uniquely African philosophy of art was essential to the Negritude movement. Senghor made the case that the goal of African art was not to represent reality as it was, but rather to represent sub-reality, the world of these forces that were described in his ontology. The purpose of the art was not to give visually perfect or accurate representations of things as they were, but rather things as the forces within them represented them. This is why African objects of art were not merely aesthetic objects, but religious ones as well, and also why they overemphasize and underemphasize certain characteristics, because they're emphasizing elements essential to the life forces, not attempting to create a visual facsimile, representing not what was observable, but the underlying forces. Senghor made the case that these life forces were kinds of rhythms that were alive and free, not bound to specific conventions, but rather illuminating the spirit. Césaire's expression of an aesthetics of Negritude did not differ from Senghor's, as they did in the ontology, but rather approached it from a different direction. Césaire uses Nietzsche's distinction between Dionysian art, which speaks to emotions by representing more primal, obscure, rhythmic forces that fit the object into a web of life and life forces, and Apollonian art, which speaks to the mind by creating more meticulous, artificial representations that divorced an individual work from its surroundings and separated and set it apart to frame the conversation. Hopefully we'll do a video at some point in the future on Nietzsche's distinction between Dionysian and Apollonian. For Césaire, traditional Western aesthetics had gotten to a point of overemphasizing the Apollonian tradition at the expense of the Dionysian, and an aesthetics of Negritude would not overemphasize necessarily the Dionysian side, but rather balance the two better, including more of that primal, rhythmic life force within the art, as opposed to the static, almost mathematical, pure form of the Apollonian tradition. And tying a piece of work more into the world around it, as opposed to trying to set it aside or separate it from the world in a world of form. Negritude as a movement was decidedly Marxist. Though Césaire and Senghor rejected mainstream socialism to varying degrees. Their central concern was with the view expressed by Sartre in the previous video, that race was simply a subjective, concrete particular compared to the universal abstract of a class. Césaire argued that this thin universalism failed to address the specific needs and experiences of African peoples, and that there were dangers in excessive universalization as well. Negritude, therefore, attempted to construct a uniquely African socialism based around pre-colonial communitarian societies. They focused on the early works of Marx, where his focus was much more on ethics, art, and humanism, and less on economics. These are the same tensions that we saw at the end of the last video between questions of whether society should be colorblind and focus on eliminating race as a concept, or if society should accept that race is an important feature of life and acknowledge the different experiences of individuals of various races. Stay tuned for upcoming videos on the philosophy of race, which will look at these questions in depth and more. Now, let's take a look at a couple objections before we go. So while Senghor and Césaire do a good job of outlining their claims and drawing the connections between those claims and traditional African belief, there's less work put into a rigorous philosophical defense of those claims. The ontology outline raises a lot of questions around how it seems that people have bidirectional interactions. They act upon each other, not just the stronger one acting on the weaker one. Stronger one, it doesn't seem to always be the case that happens. It seems that people have relationships that are really partnerships, where they interact with each other. And communities can have kind of equally beneficial partnerships. It's not simply an interaction of force. Questions of how force seems to be much more diverse a concept than a single thing that could be ranked linearly. Hamat, for example, might be very smart and be able to act on Harry by convincing him of any conclusion, while Harry might be physically strong and able to act on Hamat by picking him up. And so who has the greater life force? There's also, of course, questions of kind of a Meinonian ontology of what are these life forces and what are they doing for our ontology? Why do we need to include them? So there could be a range of questions arrayed there. And they might be answered had more people expressed and worked on this ontology. And as Negritude moves forward, it's possible that there will be more expressions of this. But as of now, this is somewhat limited. In terms of the aesthetics, one might question whether Dionysian art is a feature of culture or a feature of technology. Lacking tools to make accurate representations might lead one to make symbolic representations, i.e., early European art looks more Dionysian than Apollonian, and as technologies advanced to create more representative art, it was done. One might question whether diverse cultures, either in Africa or Europe, can really be grouped together into a claimed overarching aesthetic, or if there's actually a lot more nuance. Africa is a very big and very diverse place, and one of the big challenges for Negritude is the idea that all of these different cultures could be united under one single philosophy in the way that Césaire and Senghor are trying to do. What do you think? Do you agree with the claims of Negritude? Do you think our art should be more Dionysian? Is there a life force that defines existence? Should we attempt to eliminate differences by race or acknowledge them? Or rather, ignore and wash over differences by race or acknowledge them, depending on how you frame it. Watch this video and more here at Carneades.org. Stay tuned for more videos on African philosophy coming soon. If you like this video and you want to see more, hit the subscribe button, hit the notification bell so you can stay up to date whenever we publish a new video. Stay skeptical, everybody.